Hey there, so let's talk inflation. Why is it bad? Why are we always trying to lower and stabilize it? Specifically, what are the true and false worries about inflation? How do we adjust for inflation? And why do policymakers try to maintain a stable rate of price increases? So there's some widespread misperceptions and confusion about inflation, and that's all right. It can be a confusing topic. But economists will say inflation hurts the economy, but most people don't quite understand why. Prices going up alone isn't enough to make us worse off. Again, here's just a little bit of an overview. The relationship between the price level and the actual inflation rate is something we've already talked about. The inflation rate is just the percent change in the consumer price index, or the price index from one year to the next. To clarify, here are some terms. There's deflation, which is a drop in prices, as opposed to inflation, which is a rise in prices. And there's hyperinflation, which is super fast, prolonged inflation, usually in the hundreds or thousands of percent per year. And if you're wondering which one is more of a problem historically for the US, deflation is probably more of a problem than hyperinflation. And specifically, the reason deflation is a problem is that people will stop spending money to wait for prices to drop in the future, and this slows down the economy. And probably why deflation was happening in the first place was the economy was super slow, people's spending was dropped, and so there wasn't much coming into the economy to keep prices up. And the danger of hyperinflation is probably more well known because it has happened in Germany. The first slide was from Germany in the interwar period, when there was so much debt that the German government had to print out money to pay off the debt. Printed out too much, hyperinflation ensued, and money became so worthless that people used it for fuel in their furnaces, and basically the economy lost its money. And economies need money. Modern specialized economies absolutely need money for people to be able to trade with each other. So the danger of hyperinflation is that you lose money. People also try to spend it real fast because it's losing value every second. And so that pushes up prices even further, creating a hyperinflationary spiral. And once people stop using money because they don't trust it, that slows the economy down too. So what do we want? Neither of these situations, but stable prices. That's better for the economy. So we've talked about the consumer price index. You might want to know what's inside it. Generally speaking, the average urban person in the U.S. spends about 43% of their income on housing, about 15% on food and beverages, and medical care, transportation, apparel, it's all in there. Now, this should probably come as no surprise, but of course, inflation and the consumer price index itself are not perfect measures. They're both subject to problems, just like the unemployment rate is subject to problems. The GDP measure is subject to problems. It's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. So the substitution bias is that we substitute away from more expensive goods towards cheaper goods, and so inflation might be counting good A when you've switched over to a different brand, right? Because brand A got more expensive. And secondly, the quality or new goods bias. When smartphones get better every year and their price remains the same, the consumer price index can't really handle that kind of problem. And it's really that we've gotten more for our money. So it's counting price, but it's not counting quality. So back to the main topic. What's bad with inflation? Let's clear up some confusion. Let's remember that just like we did with GDP, we want to focus on the real value rather than the nominal value. So for instance, if you're talking about your wages, you want to talk about your real wages. You want to talk about your income. You want to talk about your real income, adjusted for inflation. And this is why often inflation is confusing to people because we think we get poorer every time there's 6% inflation. Well, pay attention to your real wage. Is your nominal wage rising at 6%? Then your real wage hasn't changed. So to figure that out, you can actually do, divide through by price level to figure out your real income. But usually we are more interested in the change from year to year. So a way to think about that is the percent change in your actual income, your nominal income, minus the percent change in inflation, or a percent change in prices, rather, the actual inflation rate will give you your percent change in real income. For instance, if you get a 6% raise and inflation was 3%, you're getting an actual real raise of 3%. So your real income has risen by 3%. So in economics, it's always useful to think about purchasing power rather than nominal wages. All right, so let's do some practice around real wages. Maria expects the inflation rate to be 5%, and she's willing to pay a real interest rate of 3%. Jose expects the inflation rate to be 5% also, and he is willing to lend money if he receives a real interest rate of 3%. If the actual inflation rate is 6% and the loan contract specifies a nominal interest rate of 8%, then which of the following is true? A, Jose is glad he lent out the funds even though his real interest rate has fallen. B, Jose is sorry he lent out the funds since his real interest rate is now 9%. C, Maria is glad she borrowed the funds because her real interest rate has fallen. Or D, Maria is sorry she borrowed the funds since her real interest rate is now 9%. Let's pause, and then I'll work the problem with you. So first of all, we want to set up the problem, and this can be set up just like the real wage problem. Anytime you have a nominal something that's in percent terms, like a nominal increase in your wages, and you have the percent change inflation rate, you plug that in, you subtract that out from whatever the nominal percent change you're looking at, and you get the real. So there's like three things going on here. There's what Jose plans, what Maria plans, and then what actually happens. Because the question here is really about, are they happy or sad that inflation ended up being different than what it was expected? So Maria is willing to pay 3% interest, and we can rework this equation and plug in what we know and figure out what we don't know. She was planning for the inflation rate to be 5%. So we know that she was planning for the nominal interest rate then to be 8%. So like her expected nominal interest rate to pay was 8%. So Jose's expectations and expected nominal interest rate is going to be the same because he had the same expectation to actually get 3% real interest rate. He expected the same as Maria did about inflation to be 5%. And what's left is they both thought that one was going to borrow from the other at 8%, which adjusted for inflation would be 3%. But reality was different. So this is a question about, look what happens when inflation is higher than expected in this case, or basically different than expected. It's dangerous. Here we go. So in a sense, what happened was they agreed to that 8% nominal interest rate, right? That's this number. But inflation, the actual inflation rate was not 5%, but 6%. So what was left over is that Jose was only collecting 2% real interest rate on his money. He was letting Maria borrow the money. During that period where she was borrowing the money, prices rose by 6%. And so although she was paying 8%, there's only 2% left over for Jose. So he is getting less than he originally thought, and Maria is paying less than she originally thought. So one of them is happier, one of them is sadder. Jose is bummed, Maria is happy. So the correct answer is not this one. His real interest rate did fall, but he is not glad. B is also wrong because his real interest rate is 2%, not 3%. And Maria is glad she borrowed the funds because her real interest rate has fallen. That's the correct answer. And D is not right because her real interest rate is not 9. And she's also happy. Moving on, here's a look at actual U.S. inflation rates. You can see periods where we've had them fairly recently highest inflation, double-digit inflation, are in the oil shock years of the 70s, where oil prices went a lot higher, imported oil, and that pushed up the prices of a lot of things. And you can see we've had some deflation in the recent history as well. One question to ask yourself is, what do I predict will happen to inflation rates during recession? So recessions are always shown on these graphs by these vertical gray bars. So these are all recessions. And we find that inflation tends to, although not always, right, doesn't do it there, but it tends to drop during recession, right? So maybe not right at the beginning, but eventually the drop in spending that comes during a recession actually lets the air out of prices, right? So prices are dropping because not as many people are putting money into the economy to buy stuff. So starting to piece together our model of what happens during recessions, we expect a couple of things, right? We expect that GDP drops, that's the definition of a recession. We're learning that inflation usually drops, although not always. And then, quick gut check for you, what happens to unemployment during a recession? That's right, unemployment rate usually rises. Always rises, really, as people are producing less stuff. So there's your trifecta of things that we worry about and are symptoms of a recession. And they're all in reverse. When times are good, GDP is rising. Inflation usually is stable, maybe rising, and unemployment is dropping. Is the U.S. alone in how we've experienced inflation? No. Globalization and countries being dependent on each other for trade means that a lot of the times conditions will be the same in a lot of countries. So you're seeing other rich countries like the U.S. experiencing very similar levels of inflation, although Germany would be a notable exception in escaping some of the shocks to inflation during the 70s. So what is to fear about inflation? Well, the dangers of inflation really are threefold, and that is winners and losers are created through no fault of their own. So the Maria and Jose story sort of was proof of that. When prices are bouncing around, there's what we call blurred price signals, and people can't make decisions as well. The free market rests on prices being a good signal and good source of information. But when prices are bouncing around, it becomes harder to observe those. And also, and perhaps most importantly for macroeconomics, it causes difficulties in long-term planning and can slow your economy down. So let's talk about each of these. First, just to look at some data. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the growth rate of labor productivity. So how much are workers producing? We're also looking at inflation rate. They're both on the same graph over time. So the inflation rate is the more spiky red one up here, and the lower one is the labor productivity. And the assertion is that sometimes rising inflation rates cause lower productivity, and lower inflation rates cause higher productivity, or at least are correlated. We can't really say that one causes the other, but the correlation is interesting and provocative, and it means perhaps that the economy does better, people produce more stuff when inflation rates are stable and under control. And that's kind of weird and mysterious. You wonder why those two things might be correlated with each other. One of the biggest impacts of unstable inflation is on business investment. So businesses might not be wanting to spend millions of dollars on new equipment or expansions, the very things that oftentimes will increase labor productivity, when inflation rates are bouncing around and they don't know what kind of return they'll get on that investment. They don't know what kind of interest rate they'll really pay, right, if they're borrowing to get that stuff. So uncertainty, start to think about that as a theme. Uncertainty is bad. It's bad for any long-term decisions. So Ben Bernanke, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, has a 1983 paper. He's one of the first people to look at this. But basically, you want to look at this. Look, when there's uncertainty in the macroeconomy, for a lot of reasons. One of them could be inflation, unstable inflation. That affects a firm's decision to invest. And so they might decide to wait for additional information, which means they're putting off investment, which means the economy is slowing down. Are you ready to learn some cute terms? So there's 3 specific costs of inflation that relate to the different hardships they pose on people. Shoe leather costs are, believe it or not, just like you'd think. Since cash loses its value quickly under periods of rapid inflation, people spend a lot of time going back and forth to the ATM or going back and forth. This is probably a little bit less of an issue in the age of online banking, but still we are spending more time either wearing out our shoes or wearing out our mice and our trackpads and our apps, monitoring, making sure that we're not holding too much cash. So if you happen to be lucky enough to have a lot of income, more than your expenses, you're taking that extra money and keeping it out of cash, keeping it out of your checking account and putting it into something that will earn some interest, because otherwise you're losing a whole bunch to inflation. Quick little piece of evidence: the shoe leather cost of inflation in Israel, 500% inflation in 1985. People spent a lot of time waiting at banks, perhaps picking up their paychecks so they could spend them quickly and not let them rot in there while inflation eats away at their value. And the menu cost. Let's say you own a restaurant and prices are changing every day. You got to figure out how to do prices without having to reprint your menus every day. So, it's just time and money wasted for businesses that could be using that time and money for other more productive endeavors. That's one of the costs of inflation. And for our purposes here in macroeconomics, this unit of account cost, that's a pretty big deal. And that's the way that inflation makes it harder to understand prices and to make decisions. Basically, money used to be before inflation hit, money was a pretty stable way to talk about prices. But when inflation is high and unpredictable, money is not such a good measure. So that's it for this section. What did we talk about? The true and the false worries about inflation, why policymakers are worried about inflation and try to maintain a stable rate of it. Sorry, you could hear my dog's ears flapping in the background. She must have known I was showing a slide of a different dog.